Imagine you're managing a professional sports franchise. You've got a roster filled with veteran players who have, spent decades perfecting their craft.
Right.
They know the playbook inside and out, they execute under pressure, and frankly, they're the sole reason your stadium is packed every single night.
Exactly. They're the foundation of your success.
Right. But now, imagine walking into the locker room right before the playoffs and firing every single one of your top scorers. Why?
Mm.
Because you realize you could hire a bunch of rookies, people who have never played the game before, for the league minimum, just to save a few bucks on the salary cap.
It would be professional suicide.
You'd be called the worst manager in the history of the sport. And yet, this is exactly what one of the most dominant retail giants in American history did to its own workforce.
It really is a staggering level of self-destruction when you frame it that way. I mean, we are talking about a company that spent half a century building an empire on the expertise of its people, only to turn around and systematically dismantle that very foundation, all to appease a spreadsheet.
Welcome to this Peak to Dust documentary deep dive. If you were buying consumer electronics anytime between the 1980s and the early 2000s, you almost certainly remember this empire. You remember walking into a massive circuit city.
Oh, absolutely.
You remember those distinct red tile walkways that felt like you were walking the red carpet of retail? And you definitely remember the highly knowledgeable, slightly aggressive sales staff in the red shirts ready to guide you through the incredibly intimidating world of early consumer tech.
Yes.
But our mission for this deep dive today isn't a nostalgic trip down memory lane. We are digging into the raw data, the SEC filings, and the historical records to figure out how a company goes from an initial $13,000 investment, completely obliterating the stock market averages, to abruptly liquidating 567 stores and putting 30,000 people out of work seemingly overnight.
And we have an absolute mountain of evidence to pull from to understand this collapse. For this analysis, we're relying heavily on Alan Wurtzel's incredibly candid historical account, Good to Great to Gone.
Right, a crucial text.
We're also looking at Jim Collins' landmark business study, Good to Great. Plus, we've pulled the granular SEC filings, specifically zeroing in on their pivotal 1999 annual report alongside Federal Trade Commission documents.
And to really grasp the Wall Street perspective, we're incorporating contemporary financial analyses from institutions like, KeyBank, Standard & Poor's, and JP Morgan.
Right. And what's absolutely staggering about these sources is that they don't describe a company that was murdered by Amazon.
Yeah, that's the myth, right? Everyone thinks internet shopping killed the big box store.
Exactly. But when you actually read the internal memos and the strategic roadmaps, you realize Circuit City wasn't murdered. It committed a prolonged, agonizing corporate suicide.
To really grasp the gravity of how far this company fell, we have to start by looking at just how incredibly high they climbed. And that story starts in 1949 with a guy getting a haircut.
It really does. Samuel S. Wurtzel was sitting in a barber's chair in Richmond, Virginia in 1949. While he's getting his haircut, he hears a piece of local gossip. He hears that the very first commercial television station in the South was about to go live. Now, most people in 1949 would just think, maybe I'll get to watch some programs. Wurtzel heard that and saw an entire industry being born.
Right, because before that, a television was just a weird, expensive piece of furniture that showed static in most parts of the country. Wurtzel realizes that the moment that broadcast signal goes live, every single family in Richmond is going to want that box in their living room.
Exactly. It was a masterclass in market anticipation. He took $13,000, which, that was a considerable sum at the time, and opened a small retail store called Ward's Companies specifically to sell television sets.
He understood that the television was about to become the cultural hearth of the American home.
He did, and that foresight paid off massively. They scaled aggressively throughout the 1950s. By 1961, they made their first public offering at $5.37.5 per share.
Wow.
Yeah, and then 7 years later, in 1968, they grew from the over-the-counter market to a listing on the American Stock Exchange.
So they built this incredibly solid regional empire. But retail in the 50s and 60s was still very much a mom-and-pop world, right?
Very much so.
You'd go to a small local hardware store for one thing, a local radio shop for another, or maybe you'd brave a massive department store like Sears. But in the 1970s, Samuel's son, Alan Wurtzel, takes over, and he initiates a total paradigm shift. In 1974, he introduces something called the loading dock concept.
The loading dock was really the primordial ooze from which the modern electronics superstore evolved. Alan Wurtzel realized that the consumer appetite for electronics was exploding.
Right, it wasn't just televisions anymore.
No, it was Pioneer stereo equipment. It was the early Sony Betamax VCRs, massive home audio receivers. He realized that the fragmented mom-and-pop model couldn't handle this volume, and the traditional department stores, well, they just treated electronics as an afterthought.
So he essentially says, what if we just take a massive warehouse, stack the merchandise to the ceiling, and let people shop directly from the pile?
That was the exact ethos. Stack it deep and sell it cheap, but offer a selection that no local shop could ever match. This concept was wildly successful. By 1982, they had refined this into the Circuit City Superstore and were operating 100 outlets.
100 outlets by 82.
Yes. And to cement this new identity, in 1984, Ward's officially changed its corporate name to Circuit City Stores, Inc., and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. This was also the pivotal moment when Alan Wurtzel moved to the chairman role and handed the CEO reins to a man named Richard Sharp.
And Richard Sharp's era is where Circuit City becomes the cultural icon we all remember. The physical footprint of these stores was completely unhinged for the time. We were talking about floor plans that started at 6,000 square feet and eventually swelled to nearly an acre of pure retail space under one roof.
It was massive.
And the layout was an accident. They designed these stores with the precision of a casino.
The theatricality of the floor plan was a brilliant exercise in retail psychology. The stores were famously laid out like baseball diamonds. When you walked in the front door's home plate, essentially you were greeted by this striking red tile walkway.
Right.
But you couldn't just walk straight to the TVs. The layout intentionally forced you to walk past the service department first.
I remember that. It was always right there at the entrance, this big counter with technicians tinkering with stuff.
That was a highly calculated psychological signal to the consumer. In the 1980s, these devices broke frequently. By putting the repair center front and center, Circuit City was subliminally telling every customer who walked through the door, we service what we sell.
Which is huge for consumer confidence.
Exactly. It's saying, you are safe buying this expensive machine from us because if it breaks, we will fix it.
That is so smart. It removes the anxiety of a massive purchase before you even see the price tag. And then once you follow that red tile road, you are confronted with the wall of eyes, dozens and dozens of televisions, all tuned to the exact same channel, blasting the same image. It was totally immersive.
It really was.
But wait, let me pause here and push back on something in the sources. The grand layout is impressive. The red tiles, the wall of TVs, it all clearly moved inventory. But the documentation explicitly states that Richard Sharp's background was in computers, not traditional retail intuition.
Yes, that's correct.
So was the physical store layout really the secret sauce, or was something else going on?
You've hit on the absolute core of their 1980s dominance. The theatrical floor plan was the public-facing magic trick. But the true hidden engine of Circuit City was Richard Sharp's technological infrastructure operating behind the curtain.
Tell me about that.
Sharp wasn't a retail guy. He originally came into contact with Circuit City because he was hired as a consultant to install an advanced computer system to control their sales and inventory. He ended up building a highly sophisticated information system that was practically science fiction for the retail industry at the time.
Okay, we need to break this down. For a listener who doesn't, spend their weekends reading logistics textbooks, how exactly does a fancy computer system in 1984 translate to utterly crushing the stock market?
It all comes down to a concept called the inventory turnover ratio. In retail, your biggest enemy is stuff sitting in a back room not being sold.
Because it's just taking up space.
Right. Every day a washing machine sits in your storage room, it's costing you money in rent, and it's tying up cash that you could be using to buy newer, better products. Before Sharp's system, if you had 100 stores, you needed 100 massive back rooms filled with heavy, bulky inventory. Refrigerators, massive console TVs, washer-dryer sets.
Which means your stores have to be gigantic, but mostly just to hold boxes, not to actually display things for customers to look at.
Precisely. What Sharp's computer system allowed Circuit City to do was implement a hub-and-spoke centralized distribution model.
Meaning what, exactly?
Instead of hoarding all those massive items at every single retail location, they kept just the floor models in the store. The actual inventory was stored in massive centralized distribution warehouses that served an entire region.
I see.
When you bought that refrigerator at the store, the computer instantly pinged the central warehouse, and the item was loaded onto a delivery truck to go straight to your house.
Oh, wow. So they basically eliminated the back room. which means that 1-acre store isn't half filled with cardboard boxes. The entire acre is pure, high-margin selling space.
Exactly. Because they didn't need to store a dozen washing machines on site, they could fill that newly freed up floor space with rows and rows of the hot new high-margin consumer electronics of the 1980s. VCRs, microwaves, cordless phones, early personal computers.
They maximize their retail footprint while drastically reducing their decentralized storage costs.
It was a masterpiece of operational efficiency. Their inventory was moving so fast, their turnover ratio was the envy of the entire retail sector.
So they have this beautiful, psychologically manipulative store layout, and they have this invisible, hyper-efficient logistical brain running the inventory.
Yeah.
But you still need a mechanism to actually convince a human being to part with their money.
You do.
And that brings us to what I think is the most defining and ultimately the most controversial element of the entire Circuit City story, the commission sales force.
In the 1980s and early 1990s, consumer technology was wildly intimidating. Buying a personal computer or a VCR was not like buying a toaster.
No, not at all.
It required a significant capital outlay, sometimes $1,000 or more in 1980s money, and it involved a steep learning curve. People didn't know what a composite cable was or how an RF modulator worked or what RAM meant.
If you were a parent in 1985 trying to figure out how to hook up a Nintendo to a Zenith wood-paneled TV, you needed adult supervision. You needed a guide.
And Circuit City provided that guide through a high-touch sales model. Approximately 60% of their in-store sales associates were paid strictly on commission.
Strictly on commission.
Yes. These were not cashiers ringing up items. They were highly trained product specialists. The company literally required them to take weekly quizzes to ensure they understood the minute technical details of every product they were selling.
I was reading through some of the employee testimonials in the source material, and it is wild. One former employee noted that they could sell absolutely anything in the store, big screen TVs, the early brick cell phones, digital cameras.
Right.
And because of the commission structure, they were averaging $28 an hour in the 1990s. That was phenomenal money. But they weren't just selling the base product, right? The real money was in the ecosystem.
Exactly. The commission sales counselor was financially incentivized to remove the friction of uncertainty for the buyer. When a customer walked in, overwhelmed and confused, the salesperson provided total expertise.
And build trust.
Yes. But in exchange for holding the customer's hand, that salesperson was expertly cross-selling the high-margin accessories. The expensive gold-plated audio cables, the surge protectors, the carrying cases, and most importantly, the extended warranties.
This makes so much sense. It perfectly aligns the employee's motivation to make a fat paycheck with the buyer's deep anxiety about buying a complicated machine. Yes, the prices at Circuit City might have been a bit higher, but you were paying for the peace of mind that the guy in the red shirt actually knew what he was talking about.
That high-touch model fully justified the incredibly wide profit margins Circuit City enjoyed for 2 decades. And the financial data from this period is just staggering.
Let's hear it.
According to the SEC filings, Circuit City hit the $1 billion sales mark in February 1987. Just 3 years later, by 1990, sales had doubled to $2 billion.
Incredible growth.
It was. And by the fiscal year 2000, they were a juggernaut, generating over $12.6 billion in sales, with net profits reaching $327 million.
Let's put those numbers in context, because billions can sound like abstract math to the listener. To really understand how dominant they were, we have to look at Jim Collins' landmark business book, Good to Great.
Such an important study for this case.
Collins and his research team analyzed over 1,400 companies that appeared on the Fortune 500 list from 1965 to 1995. They were looking for companies that didn't just have a good run, but fundamentally transformed into undisputed, legendary industry leaders. Out of those 1,400 massive corporations, Circuit City was one of only 11 companies selected that made the leap.
And the metric Collins used is fascinating. From 1982 to 1997, Circuit City generated cumulative stock returns that were 18.5 times better than the overall market.
18.5 times.
Yes. To put that in perspective, they drastically outperformed absolute titans of American industry like General Electric, Intel, and Coca-Cola. For a 15-year stretch, if you were investing in the stock market, Circuit City was arguably the best-performing, most reliable company in the United States.
Okay, so they are sitting on top of the world. They have the best supply chain, the best sales staff, and stock returns that are making Wall Street drool. But as with every great tragedy, invincibility breeds arrogance.
It almost always does.
And that arrogance leads us to a decision made in 1988 that, in hindsight, is one of the most catastrophic missed opportunities in business history. We found this detailed in Alan Wurtzel's book.
Yes, the Best Buy decision.
It's the fall of 1988. There is a rival electronics retailer limping along, struggling to survive, burning through cash. The founder of this struggling rival comes to Circuit City, hat in hand, and offers to sell his entire business to them for a measly $30 million. And the name of that struggling rival is Best Buy.
Richard Schultz, the founder of Best Buy, literally handed Circuit City the keys to a total monopoly on a silver platter. It was an acquisition that would have permanently cemented Circuit City's dominance and fundamentally altered the landscape of global retail.
And what did they do?
Richard Sharp, the CEO who had engineered their brilliant logistical systems, flatly declined the offer.
$30 million. For a company doing billions in sales, that is pocket change. That's a rounding error on their balance sheet. Wurtzel notes in his book that Sharp's view is that buying them was completely unnecessary.
Right.
Sharp believed that all Circuit City had to do was open one of their beautiful red-tiled superstores in Minneapolis, which was Best Buy's home turf, and, to quote Sharp directly, blow them away.
It is the ultimate expression of corporate hubris. But we have to look deeper than just ego here. Was it arrogance? Yes. But it was also a fatal structural misreading of macroeconomic forces.
How so?
Sharp and his executive team suffered from what we call incumbency blindness. They looked at their 18.5 times market return. They looked at their army of highly trained commissioned staff, and they concluded that their specific business model was a law of physics. They thought they were inherently invincible.
But they were missing a massive shift in the market.
What they entirely failed to anticipate was the commoditization curve of consumer electronics.
Okay, let's explain that term for the listener. What exactly is a commoditization curve in this context, and why did it make Circuit City's model obsolete?
Think about the life cycle of a new technology. When a groundbreaking piece of tech is first invented, let's say the VCR in 1980s, it is expensive, it is complex, and the general public has no idea how it works.
Right.
It is a specialty item. Because it's complex, the consumer requires a highly trained expert to explain it to them, which means they are willing to shop at a premium store like Circuit City and talk to a commissioned salesperson.
The uncertainty is high, so the need for hand-holding is high.
But as time passes, the technology becomes standardized. The manufacturing processes get cheaper, the interfaces become user-friendly. Suddenly, it's not a specialty item anymore, it's a commodity. It's plug and play.
I see where this is going.
By 1995, nobody needed a commissioned expert to explain how to plug a VCR into a wall socket. The public universally understood the technology. And when a product becomes a commodity, the informational advantage that justified Circuit City's expensive, high-touch sales force completely evaporates.
This is such a crucial insight. Circuit City is paying all these experts $28 an hour to explain a product that a teenager could now figure out in 5 minutes. And Best Buy realized this, didn't they? After almost going bankrupt, they looked at the board and completely changed the rules of the game.
Best Buy had a massive realization. In 1989, just a year after they tried to sell themselves to Circuit City, they completely abandoned the commission sales model.
Completely dropped.
Yes, they pivoted to a low-pressure, self-service, heavily discounted, low-overhead model. They realized that consumers now just wanted to walk in, grab a TV in a box, and leave without being badgered to buy a gold-plated warranty.
Right.
To drive foot traffic, Best Buy started stocking massive volumes of low-margin, everyday items like CDs, movies, and computer software.
They turned themselves into a grocery store for electronics. You go in for the new Nirvana CD and, oh, look, there's a television on sale.
Precisely. They assumed the modern, price-sensitive customer would simply pick the hardware off the shelf themselves. Circuit City looked at Best Buy's chaotic warehouse-style stores with untrained hourly workers and scoffed.
They really thought they were above it.
They genuinely believed their high-touch premium model was superior. They failed to see that Best Buy was skating to where the puck was going to be, while Circuit City was fiercely defending where the puck used to be.
So they think their sales model makes them untouchable. But invincibility breeds arrogance. And that arrogance is what led them to make one of the most baffling technological bets in retail history. We are entering the late 1990s now.
A dark time for their strategic planning.
The core retail model is slowly springing leaks because of Best Buy. But instead of fixing the ship, Circuit City decides they want to invent a completely new way to watch movies. I am talking, of course, about the DivX disaster.
DivX, which stood for Digital Video Express, is a fascinating case study and a company fundamentally misunderstanding consumer psychology. In 1998, the standard DVD format was just starting to enter the market.
And it was a clean format, right?
Yes, it was an open standard, meaning any manufacturer could build a player and you could buy a disc and own it forever. Circuit City looked at this and decided they wanted to control the ecosystem. So they partnered with a Los Angeles entertainment law firm and poured over $200 million of capital into developing a proprietary disposable DVD format.
Okay, I have to walk the listener through how this actually works. It sounds absurd. Let's say it's a Friday night in 1998. I go to Circuit City and I buy a DivX movie disc for about $5.
Right.
I take it home, I put it into my special DivX player, which I also had to buy specifically from Circuit City. The moment I hit play, a 48-hour countdown timer begins. I can watch the movie as many times as I want for 2 days, but what happens on hour 49?
On hour 49, the disc locks itself. It becomes completely unplayable. If you want to watch it again, you can't just hit play. Your DivX player had to be physically connected to a telephone line in your house.
A telephone line.
Yes. The machine would literally dial out over your phone line, connect to a central DivX server, charge your credit card an additional fee, and then unlock the disc for another 48 hours. If you didn't want to pay, you were instructed to literally throw the plastic disc in the garbage.
It's hard to even process the friction of this. It's 1998. If someone picks up the phone in the kitchen while my DVD player is trying to authorize the movie, does the movie just stop? They were essentially trying to invent digital video on demand, but they anchored it to physical plastic trash and dial-up modems.
It was an unmitigated disaster on every conceivable front. First, consumers absolutely hated the privacy implications. The idea that a machine in their living room was secretly making phone calls in the middle of the night to report their viewing habits to a corporate server in Virginia was deeply unsettling.
Totally.
Secondly, other retailers looked at this and revolted. Why would Best Buy or Walmart sell DivX players or discs when doing so would directly enrich the proprietary patents owned by their primary competitor, Circuit City? They simply refused to carry it.
And the movie studios weren't exactly thrilled either, right?
Not at all. Major entertainment conglomerates like Sony Pictures and Warner Home Video flatly refused to release their films in the DivX format. They had already invested millions into the standard open DVD format. They had no interest in creating a fragmented market.
Right.
So you had a format that consumers hated, competitors boycotted, and studios ignored. The entire venture collapsed within 9 months.
9 months. They burned $250 million in less time than it takes to grow a human baby.
And, the financial damage was just brutal. It resulted in a massive $114 million first quarter charge in 1999 alone. Circuit City was forced to issue $100 cash rebates to furious early adopters who had bought these expensive machines that were now completely useless.
What a nightmare.
It was a massive distraction of capital and executive attention at the exact moment Best Buy was aggressively expanding.
So they set $200 million on fire in the tech space. But the strategic self-lacerations didn't stop there. They extended to their core physical retail offerings. In the year 2000, under a new CEO named Alan McCullough, Circuit City looked at their massive, beautiful showrooms and made the abrupt decision to completely stop selling large appliances.
They literally ripped the washing machines, the dryers, the ovens, and the refrigerators out of their stores.
Why? What was the logic?
The logic, ostensibly, was about maximizing the profit per square foot. The executives believed that large appliances took up too much physical space on the showroom floor and yielded lower margins compared to smaller consumer electronics, like the new digital cameras and early flat-screen computer monitors.
They wanted to cram more small boxes onto the shelves.
Yes. But to understand the sheer gravity of this unforced error, we have to look at the financial reality of their appliance business in the year 2000.
Let's hear the numbers. How big was this business they just threw in the dumpster?
At the time McCullough made this decision, major appliances were generating $1.6 billion in revenue for Circuit City. That accounted for 10 to 15% of their entire corporate business.
That is staggering.
They weren't just dabbling in appliances. They were the second largest appliance retailer in the entire United States, trailing only behind Sears. They had a massive, loyal customer base who trusted them for these critical home purchases.
This is where the story just becomes infuriating from an analytical standpoint. They take $1.6 billion of reliable, steady revenue and voluntarily hand it to their competitors. And what makes this infinitely worse is the historical timing. What massive generational economic event kicked off in the United States immediately after the year 2000?
The residential real estate and housing boom.
Right.
From 2001 to 2007, the United States saw millions of new homes being built, bought, and flipped. And every single one of those new homes required new refrigerators, new dishwashers, and new washing machines. By abruptly exiting the appliance market, Circuit City voluntarily disqualified themselves from participating in one of the greatest economic consumer windfalls of the modern era.
They essentially gift-wrapped billions of dollars in guaranteed sales and handed it directly to Best Buy, Lowe's, and Home Depot. And beyond the lost revenue, think about the psychological damage to the customer. Let's say you're a family remodeling your kitchen in 2003. You want a new stainless steel fridge, and while you're at it, you want a new flat-screen TV for the living room.
Right.
You walk into Best Buy, and you can buy both in one trip. You walk into Circuit City, and they essentially tell you to get out and go shop somewhere else for your home needs.
It fractured the shopping habit. Best Buy became the one-stop destination for the home, while Circuit City relegated itself to a niche electronics boutique, but trapped in an acre-sized building.
But wait, this brings up a glaring, massive contradiction that I could not figure out when I was reading the source materials.
What's a...
If the core retail business is failing this spectacularly, if they are writing off hundreds of millions on DivX, if they just threw away $1.6 billion in appliance revenue, if Best Buy is stealing all their foot traffic, why didn't the alarms go off in the boardroom? Why wasn't the CEO screaming that the ship was sinking? How did leadership look at their balance sheets in 2001 and 2002 and not see the terminal decline of their brick-and-mortar stores?
That contradiction is perhaps the most fascinating and frankly chilling corporate reality we uncovered in this entire deep dive. The reason leadership didn't panic was because the rot of the retail store was being masked by a highly lucrative illusion.
An illusion.
Yes, specifically alternative revenue streams like their CarMax spinoff, but most deceptively, the operations of the first North American national bank.
Hang on. Circuit City owned a bank. I thought they sold TVs.
They did both. Circuit City operated its own private label credit card bank. When you went to the checkout counter to buy a $1,000 computer, the cashier would inevitably ask, "Would you like to put this on your Circuit City credit card and pay no interest for 6 months?"
Sure, standard retail practice.
If you agreed, you weren't just getting a store loyalty card, you were entering into a financial agreement with a banking entity wholly owned and operated by Circuit City.
Let's break down the mechanics of this, because I want the listener to understand exactly how a retail store is actually just a bank in disguise. If I buy a TV for $1,000, the store maybe makes $100 in retail profit margin, right?
Yeah.
But what happens when I put it on the store credit card?
The mechanics are predatory, but immensely profitable. If you pay it off in the promotional window, fine. But the business model relies on the fact that a vast percentage of consumers will not. Once that promotional window closes, the First North American National Bank would slam the consumer with exorbitant interest rates.
How high are we talking?
Often 24% or higher, retroactively applied to the entire purchase amount. And if you missed a payment by a single day, they hit you with massive late fees.
So they might only make $100 selling me the TV, but over the next 3 years, they might make $500 purely on the interest and the late fees from the credit card I used to buy it.
Exactly. It was a Trojan horse of profitability operating inside a failing retail shell. The profits generated by the bank's interest rates and late fees were astronomical, and those banking profits were consolidated into the overall corporate earnings reports of Circuit City Stores, Inc.
Oh my God. So when the middle managers and the executive board are sitting in their conference rooms looking at the consolidated bottom line for the quarter, they see a green arrow pointing up. They see sustained, massive profit growth.
Alan Wurtzel specifically noted this phenomenon in his analysis. Middle management looked at those healthy profit margins and genuinely believed that their retail stores were outperforming Best Buy. They thought their merchandising and sales strategies were winning.
But it was all a mirage.
In reality, if you stripped away the financial injection from the credit card bank, the brick-and-mortar retail engine was already dying. They were losing money on the actual selling of electronics. In Wurtzel's words, they were fooling themselves. The bank was a brilliant illusionist's trick that completely hid the fact that Best Buy was utterly destroying them on volume, foot traffic, and inventory turns.
It's like a restaurant that serves terrible, rotting food, but they make so much money off the ATM fees in the lobby that the owner thinks he's a master chef. But eventually, a mirage always fades.
It always does.
As the 2000s progressed, the retail margins shrank so violently that even the credit card bank couldn't cover up the massive holes in the hull. The truth was finally exposed. And when the executives finally panicked, instead of innovating, instead of fixing the stores, instead of building an e-commerce platform to fight the rising threat of Amazon, they attempted to brutally hack their way back to profitability.
And this is where the narrative shifts from strategic incompetence to outright corporate malice. They turn their crosshairs on the single greatest asset they possess, the very people who built their reputation, their workforce.
It's just devastating to read.
The first major assault occurred in February of 2003. Facing falling sales and reduced profitability, Circuit City management made the sweeping decision to eliminate the commission-based model entirely.
Let's look closely at the mechanics of this 2003 purge, because it defies all logic. The reporting indicates that they didn't just quietly change the compensation structure going forward. They actively fired 3,900 of their commission sales staff.
Yes.
They looked at their roster, found the people who were making the most money because they were selling the most merchandise, and terminated them. They penalized their absolute best employees for being too good at their jobs.
The stated goal by management was to save $130 million annually in payroll expenses. They believed they could simply replace these expensive expert sales counselors with lower-paid minimum wage hourly workers.
And what was the actual result?
The fallout was immediate, catastrophic, and entirely predictable. By executing this purge, the top 20% of their sales staff left the company overnight.
You just fired the only people in the building who actually know how to hook up a 5.1 surround sound system.
Exactly. These were the veterans who possessed the institutional knowledge. They were the ones who knew how to upsell the high-margin audio cables, the home theater installations, and the extended warranties that actually drove the retail profit.
Right.
By firing them, Circuit City achieved a temporary savings on payroll, but they fundamentally destroyed their revenue generation engine.
And think about the customer experience. For 20 years, the brand promise of Circuit City was, come here, and the guy in the red shirt will solve your tech problems.
Yeah.
Now, a customer walks in, prepared to drop $2,000 on a home theater, and they are greeted by an unmotivated, untrained hourly worker who doesn't know the difference between a coaxial cable and a toaster, and has absolutely zero financial incentive to figure it out. Customer service didn't just plummet, it evaporated.
And while they are systematically destroying their in-store experience, we must also look at where these stores were physically located because they were simultaneously losing the real estate war.
Oh, the locations.
Yes. Best Buy was expanding aggressively throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. They were securing prime, high-visibility, high-traffic real estate in bustling, modern shopping centers, often right next to grocery stores or major highway exits.
All right, you go buy milk, and on the way out, you pop into Best Buy to look at the new video games. Where was Circuit City building their stores during this time?
Circuit City was burdened by an aging, strategically flawed real estate portfolio. Back in the 1980s, to save on rent and overhead costs, they intentionally chose second-tier suburban strip mall locations, often tucked away in less desirable areas.
How would they do that?
The assumption in the 1980s was that Circuit City was a destination store that customers would willingly drive out of their way, past other shopping centers specifically to reach them.
Which was totally true when they were the only game in town. If you're the only place selling a Betamax, I'd drive an hour to find you.
But by 2005, the landscape had changed. When a bright, modern, well-lit Best Buy is located conveniently on your daily commute, consumers simply stopped making the trek to Circuit City's outdated, dimly lit, out-of-the-way locations.
Right.
Despite some frantic and mostly failed remodeling efforts, Circuit City found itself saddled with 1.2 million square feet of underutilized, poorly located, dead retail space. They were trapped in long-term leases for stores that nobody wanted to visit.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the most dramatic and, frankly, appalling data point in this entire documentary narrative. Let's fast forward to the year 2007. The company is bleeding profusely. They are losing the real estate war. They've thrown away their appliance revenue.
Yeah.
Amazon is beginning to fundamentally alter retail, and the stores are ghost towns.
The perfect storm.
The CEO at this time is a man named Philip Schoonover, who, in a twist of painful irony, was a former Best Buy executive. And on March 28, 2007, Schoonover executes a maneuver that permanently seals the fate of the company.
It was a Wednesday morning. At 8:15 a.m., Circuit City management initiated a coordinated nationwide firing of 300 to 400 of its most experienced, most tenured employees.
3,400 people.
This constituted nearly 10% of their entire in-store workforce. These employees were notified upon arriving for their shifts and were immediately escorted out of the buildings by management.
But the criteria for this termination is what makes it so uniquely toxic, so completely detached from human reality. They didn't fire underperformers. They didn't close specific unprofitable store locations.
No, they did not.
The sole specific criteria for termination was anyone making 51 cents or more above the established base pay range for their position. 51 cents.
It was a calculated, deliberate purge of institutional memory. These were veterans who had earned their incrementally higher wages through years, sometimes decades, of loyal service, accumulated expertise, and positive performance reviews.
It's unthinkable.
We have documentation of one 20-year veteran of the company receiving a sterile, generic, to whom it may concern termination letter. Another 19-year employee, who is making a very modest $35,000 a year, was deemed too expensive by corporate.
Wow.
They were literally told they could reapply for their exact same jobs after a cooling-off period, but at a new, drastically reduced base pay rate.
It makes my blood boil just reading it. And just to add the ultimate insult to this spectacular injury, let's talk about executive compensation. How much was Philip Schoonover, the CEO who orchestrated this mass firing of people making 35 grand a year, compensated at the very same year?
Corporate filings reveal that Philip Schoonover received $8.52 million in total compensation in 2007.
$8.5 million to fire the people who actually knew how to run the stores. So what does this all mean for corporate strategy? Because the immediate reaction to this is baffling. Wall Street initially loved it. The stock actually popped by 2% on the news of the 2007 layoffs. Did the financial markets fundamentally misunderstand the value of human capital and institutional knowledge?
Wall Street was reacting purely to a two-dimensional spreadsheet. They saw a spreadsheet where short-term labor costs were instantly reduced by millions of dollars, and the algorithm rewarded the stock accordingly.
But a spreadsheet doesn't sell televisions.
What a spreadsheet cannot quantify is the concept of institutional knowledge, and it certainly cannot quantify the psychological devastation of a workforce. Circuit City created a massive knowledge vacuum at the absolute worst possible moment in the history of consumer electronics.
Right. Think about what was happening in 2007. This isn't the era of plug-and-play VCRs anymore. This is the year the first iPhone is released. This is the explosion of high-definition flat-screen TVs, 1080p resolution, HDMI cables, complex wireless home networking routers, and Blu-ray players. The technology just took a massive leap in complexity.
Exactly. A consumer walking into a store to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a new flat-panel television and a surround sound system absolutely requires a knowledgeable guide to ensure all the components actually work together.
And they fired all those guides.
When that consumer walked into a Circuit City in the fall of 2007, they found terrified, inexperienced, minimum wage workers who had absolutely no idea how the products integrated. Furthermore, the firings hardwired a pervasive, paralyzing culture of fear throughout the entire organization.
Of course it did. If I'm an employee who survived that purge, what is the lesson I take away?
The remaining employees received a very clear, terrifying message. If you work hard, if you learn the products, if you excel at your job and earn a raise, you will eventually cross that 51-cent threshold and you will become a target for termination.
So nobody wanted to excel.
Nobody wanted to excel because excelling meant becoming too expensive to keep around. It institutionalized mediocrity.
And the financial reckoning for this incredibly stupid decision was swift, wasn't it? They amputated their own legs to save weight on the scale and then wondered why they couldn't run the marathon.
It was immediate.
Same-store sales plummeted by 12% in the critical holiday season immediately following those firings. Which brings us to the final chapter of our deep dive, the collapse and the liquidation. Stripped of its expertise, burdened by terrible real estate, hated by its own employees, and possessing absolutely no coherent e-commerce strategy to fight Amazon, Circuit City was structurally defenseless when the global economy finally fractured.
And before we talk about the economic fracture of 2008, we must examine how they deployed their capital in the years leading right up to the cliff edge.
Let's do that.
Between 2003 and 2007, facing immense pressure from activist shareholders to boost the stock price, the Circuit City Board of Directors authorized the expenditure of almost $1 billion to buy back their own stock. They were repurchasing shares on the open market at an average of $20 per share.
$1 billion in cash. Let's think about what they could have done with $1 billion. Cash that was desperately needed to remodel those decaying, depressing 1980s strip mall stores.
Yes.
Cash that was required to build a functional IT infrastructure to compete with Amazon online. Cash that could have easily retained their expert sales force for another decade. Instead, they handed $1 billion over to shareholders to artificially inflate a stock price that was completely detached from the reality of the rotting retail floor.
It is the textbook definition of value extraction prioritizing over value creation. By the time the global economy began to freeze in the summer of 2008, Circuit City had completely drained its own rainy day fund.
And then the financial crisis hits.
Right. And when the credit markets seized up during the 2008 financial crisis, the retail model finally, utterly collapsed. To understand why, you have to understand how retailers actually stock their shelves.
Let's do a quick explainer on this for the listener. If I walk into a store in October and see 100 laptops on a shelf, the store didn't necessarily buy those laptops with cash, right?
Correct. Typically, retailers rely on short-term credit from their vendors to stock their shelves, especially in the lead-up to the crucial holiday season. Sony or Hewlett-Packard ships the laptops to the retailer on credit, and the retailer pays the vendor back 30 or 60 days later, ideally after the goods are sold to the consumer.
Got it.
But in the fall of 2008, the global credit markets were frozen in terror. Vendors looked at Circuit City's rapidly declining sales, their total lack of cash reserves from the stock buybacks, and the broader economic panic, and they realized they might never get paid.
So the vendors panic and say, we aren't giving you anything on credit anymore. If you want these TVs in your store for Black Friday, you need to pay us in cash right now.
And Circuit City, having burned $1 billion on buybacks, didn't have the cash.
Right.
The debt load was unsustainable. Financial analyses from the time show the sheer scale of the panic. Circuit City owed $118 million to Hewlett-Packard. They owed $116 million to Samsung and another $60 million to Sony.
Oh, man.
Lacking any liquidity, the vendors simply cut them off. They refused to load the trucks. They stopped shipping new flat-screen TVs, laptops, and digital cameras to Circuit City stores.
And a retailer with empty shelves going into November is a dead entity walking. The timeline of the final death blow is startlingly rapid. It's like watching a building demolish in slow motion and then suddenly the whole thing just drops. On November 3, 2008, the company announces the closure of 155 stores and lays off 17% of its domestic workforce.
It was a free fall.
Just 1 week later, on November 10th, Circuit City files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. And they negotiate something called a $1.1 billion debtor-in-possession facility just to keep the lights on. Explain what that facility is.
A debtor-in-possession facility, or a DIP loan, is essentially a corporate life support machine. It is a highly specialized, highly prioritized loan given to a bankrupt company solely to keep the cashiers paid, the electricity on, and to secure just enough vendor inventory for a final holiday push while the financial doctors try to figure out if the patient can be saved. The goal of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy is reorganization. The hope was that Circuit City could use the court process to restructure their massive debt, legally break those terrible 1980s real estate leases, and emerge as a smaller, leaner company.
But the patient was already dead on the table. The structural damage was too severe, the brand reputation was completely destroyed, and the 2008 economic climate was the most hostile environment since the Great Depression. No white knight buyer emerged to save them. The company could not secure the long-term vendor support or the financing required to survive the winter.
Which brings in the undertakers of the retail business. On January 16, 2009, acting chief executive James A. Markham stepped to the podium and announced that the company would liquidate all 567 remaining U.S. stores. The reorganization had failed.
The liquidation process is just a grim, highly calculated industry of its own, isn't it? It's the vultures descending on the carcass.
It is a brutal science. Firms like Great American Group and Hudson Capital Partners stepped in to manage the death of the empire. Under the bankruptcy code amendments that had been passed in 2005, retailers only had 210 days to accept or reject existing lease agreements, which placed immense ticking clock time pressure on the liquidation process.
So they had to move fast.
Very fast. A consortium of 4 liquidation firms paid approximately $800 million for access to Circuit City's remaining merchandise, which carried a stated retail value of $1.7 billion.
We all remember seeing it. They plastered the windows with those garish yellow and red signs, store closing sale. Nothing held back. Everything must go.
Yes.
They systematically lowered the prices week by week, squeezing every last penny out of the corpse. They cleared out the televisions, then the cables, then the physical metal shelves, and finally they were selling the store fixtures, the shopping carts, and the cash registers themselves. And in the process of this massive fire sale, during the absolute worst economic downturn in decades, 30,000 employees were pushed into the ranks of the unemployed.
It is a devastating human cost. It is the tragic culmination of a company that lost its visionary edge, alienated and abused its workforce, and utterly failed to adapt to the digital age. They were outmaneuvered by Best Buy in physical retail, they were out-innovated by Amazon in digital retail, and they were hollowed out from the inside by their own executive board.
As we step back and synthesize this massive, sprawling investigation into the data, the defining takeaway of this deep dive is incredibly clear. Circuit City didn't die from one sudden fatal wound. It wasn't murdered by Amazon.
No, it wasn't.
It bled out from hundreds of strategic, self-inflicted lacerations over a decade. They possessed the sheer brilliance in 1949 to see the television revolution coming. They possessed the operational genius in the 1980s to build an inventory machine that crushed the entire stock market.
But they succumbed to massive hubris when they arrogantly passed on buying Best Buy.
Right. And they completely misread the consumer market when they exited the appliance business right before the housing boom. They allowed the financial engineering of a credit card bank to mask the rotting core of their retail floors. And most fatally, they systematically fired the very people who had built their reputation, trading decades of vital institutional knowledge for a momentary fleeting blip on a quarterly spreadsheet.
The story of Circuit City remains the ultimate cautionary tale of modern corporate America. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that no matter how dominant your market position appears today, no matter how much real estate you control, survival requires constant adaptation.
Constant adaptation.
It requires a deep, humble understanding of shifting consumer behavior. But most importantly, it requires a fundamental respect for the human capital that actually executes your business strategy on the front lines.
Which leaves us with a final, chilling modern parallel drawn directly from the source material we've explored today. Think back to that Wednesday morning in March 2007. Circuit City fired 3,400 of its most experienced, highest-paid people purely to save short-term costs. Wall Street cheered the efficiency, the stock price popped, and exactly 18 months later, the company was dead, and its shells were being sold for scrap metal.
A very sobering timeline.
Today, if you look at the news, we are watching major, supposedly invincible tech companies and modern corporations slash tens of thousands of their most experienced tenured workers. They issue these sterile corporate press releases pointing to artificial intelligence and operational efficiency as a justification. Wall Street cheers the payroll reductions, and the stock prices pop. But underneath the algorithms and the shareholder appeasement, are we simply watching the exact same playbook unfold?
It's a question we have to ask.
Are modern corporations currently erasing their own institutional knowledge, blinding themselves to the complex needs of their customers, and unknowingly dooming themselves to repeat the tragic, dusty fate of Circuit City? It's something to think about the next time you see a stock price jump after a massive layoff. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.